Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we examine the political future of Northern Ireland. This year, Northern Ireland was due to mark 100 years of existence. However, despite the best efforts of the British government and various unionist committees, a combination of COVID, spectacular divisions within the dominant unionist party, the DUP, and the reality that half the country remain uncomfortable with its very existence, celebrations have been rather muted. Instead, the province holds its collective breath as the marching season starts. This year, however, Protestants will not be marching to proclaim their traditional allegiance to Crown and Country, but on their opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has effectively placed an administrative border in the Irish Sea. Today, Alex speaks to Baroness Hoey, for many years a leading Labour politician, but at heart an Ulster Unionist, and one of the prime movers of the recent court case against the protocol. And then to Northern Ireland's top online commentator Mick Fealty to assess whether the century-old province has a future. But first, your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week featuring Dr. Jerome Kim of the International Vaccine Institute. Now, writing about Sajid Javid's appointment as a new health secretary, Bonnie Alba says he's more interested in finding contracts for his contacts to worry about his health portfolio. Chris Faulkner says, as there's no long-term data, it's impossible to claim the vaccines have been successful. Anita King says, I've had both my vaccinations and I'm perfectly fine. And finally, R. Dobson says, I've had both Pfizer vaccinations in January and in March due to work. No issues, no hassles, no side effects, all good. Now, Kate Hoey spent 30 years as a prominent Labour MP for Vauxhall in London. However, on her elevation to the House of Lords in 2020, she returned to her political roots as Baroness Hoey of Lisle Hill and Ruthin in the county of Antrim. Alex interviews her outside the House of Lords.
Kate Hoey, 30 years a Labour MP for Vauxhall, but at heart a Northern Ireland lass, because you grew up in the province, so that's your home ground.
Yes, I was born and bred there, and I went to school there, and I went to PE college, qualified as PE teacher, then decided that I wanted to go to the capital city of my country, which was London. Came over to London, took an economics degree. Don't know very much about economics, I have to say, and basically stayed in London more or less ever since, but I was back and forward quite a lot, so it's always been important to me. Although when I first came over and was an MP, being from Northern Ireland, it was actually pretty difficult because you were sort of treated, particularly when you were from a sort of unionist background, as some kind of almost pariah within the Labour Party.
In your years as a Labour MP, I mean, a huge number of issues you were known for being outspoken on, but how much was the situation in Northern Ireland a feature of your politics, or was that in the back burner because you were the MP for Vauxhall?
Well, obviously, it couldn't have been a big priority because you were so involved with your own constituency, a very, very poor constituency with huge problems and enormous amounts of casework, looking back on it. But there were always issues that, I felt very strongly about. And one of the issues actually was an internal matter, because the Labour Party never allowed people until very recently to even join the Labour Party in Northern Ireland, and yet when I was growing up there was a Northern Ireland Labour Party that had Labour MPs, some very, very well known and good Labour people. Labour then would not allow, it ended when the Troubles began, basically, because it became very sectarian, you were either one side or the other, whereas Labour was trying to bring people together. And then the Labour Party in the UK would not allow people to join. Eventually that was only ended because a very dedicated GMB worker threatened to take the Labour Party to court. They had to allow people to join, but they still don't allow anyone to put up candidates. So you join the Labour Party in Northern Ireland, but you can't actually vote for Labour. And occasionally you get people standing as sort of Labour, brackets, pretend candidates, but it's not the same. And I think that's been a real democratic deficit. I think if Labour had organised properly there from the beginning, the Conservatives take it, sometimes they're quite active, sometimes they're not, but if there'd been two mainstream parties really concerned, I think it could have made a difference to the idea that there's not real politics in Northern Ireland, and probably that's part of the reason I left.
In recent times, I mean, you've been very associated as a a prominent Labour Brexiteer, in fact, the most prominent Labour Brexiteer in some senses. Were you thinking in terms of the overall argument, or was the implications for Northern Ireland ever part of your consideration when you were advocating withdrawal from the European Union?
No, because you see, I see Northern Ireland very much part of the United Kingdom, and it was a decision to leave as the UK. And I've never really understood, well, I do understand why the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has become such an issue, but there was no need for it to become such an issue. And I think if you look back, you will remember that when we first voted to leave, for a very short period of time, the Irish government were involved in discussions with the UK at civil service level about technical arrangements, what could happen. Then Taoiseach Varadkar came in and he stopped all of that, because I think by that time, you know, I think the European Union had actually realised that Northern Ireland was a very useful little bit of the United Kingdom, that they could drip away at the British government and annoy them and indeed punish them. And you know, it was used as a kind of weapon. At the same time, the Irish government saw it as also wanting to be very much part of the EU and sticking by the EU, but also I think they saw it as a useful opportunity to get a united Ireland in terms of economics, to start economic trade together first, and then leading to a united Ireland, they hope.
And bring us right up to date, you know, as now Baroness Hoey, back in Northern Ireland. You've been one of the leading progenitors of the legal case against the protocol. And although you were unsuccessful in the Northern Irish courts, you felt you established quite an important principle. Tell us about that.
The very important principle was established. I mean, we lost in the High Court in Northern Ireland, but the Justice did rule that the protocol had breached Article 6 of the Act of Union. And we were always saying that the protocol was unlawful. Well, of course, he was able to say it's not unlawful because it's been breached, because there's been what he called implied repeal in the House of Commons when the Withdrawal Act was...
This is the 1801 Act of Union, yes, between Ireland and the rest of the UK.
Yes, and that particular act, that section is about internal trade and you know, the necessity of all of that happening. But I think the most serious thing, and it's not just for Northern Ireland, but I would have thought people in Scotland would be very interested, that, you know, if the Act of Union can be sort of repealed almost with no one knowing, and if you look back through Hansard, I think there was only one question from Emma Pengelly about the Act of Union, and she was laughed at, you know, oh, don't be silly. And now we will have to end up in the Supreme Court, because that's ultimately constitutional issues will be decided then. But, you know, we won't defeat the protocol only by a legal, I mean, obviously it would be nice if we could win that, but we need people to protest, and we need particularly a Conservative and Unionist party to realise that they have gone very badly off track on this. And I think, you know, if I'm being fair to the Prime Minister, I always like to be fair to the Prime Minister, I genuinely don't think that they realised, you know, how detailed difficulties that the protocol was going to bring, and also that the European Union could be quite so nasty, putting it simply.
Is there nothing in the Boris Johnson argument that Northern Ireland actually has the best of both worlds, that it can trade openly through the single market and also can trade with the UK? And once these transitional issues are ironed out, then this will be a privileged position economically for Northern Ireland.
Well, it doesn't really work like that, because you see, most of the trade from Northern Ireland is going to Great Britain, and most of the trade from Great Britain is coming to Northern Ireland and not actually going on into the Republic of Ireland. But also, there's nothing to stop those traders at the moment trading. Those people have been saying, oh look, that particular company is now buying things from the Republic of Ireland. Well, they always had that opportunity to do that. You know, what Brexit means to me generally for the whole of the United Kingdom is that we raise our sights a little bit higher than just dealing with the European Union.
I'm just wondering, because if you were Kate Hoey MP for County Antrim instead of Kate Hoey as was MP for Vauxhall, wouldn't you be sort of touring around the city saying, "Oh, come to County Antrim and you'll be able to trade in a single market and with the rest of the world and with the UK." Wouldn't that be what you were doing if you were an MP for Northern Ireland?
Well, no, because most of them are not doing that because they know that that's
not
really
Kate Hoey.
That's not really the answer. No, if I was the MP for County Antrim now, I would be telling my party, whichever party I was in, to be stopping implementing the protocol. I mean, it's ludicrous that we're opposing it in Northern Ireland, but we're implementing it by having people searching lorries and stopping lorries. You know, the idea that you cannot bring something in from your own country. Now, whether you believe in a united Ireland or not, and you don't like Northern Ireland, the reality is we're part of the United Kingdom. But, you know, if people want that change, then there has to be a proper mechanism to do that through the vote in the Belfast Agreement. And that's not happening. And the day-to-day difficulties, you know, and now we've got the European Union changing its attitude to feeding animals to other animals. And Northern Ireland, because it stayed within EU rules, are going to have to comply with that. So we then have the situation of people in England saying, well, we're not going to buy anything more from Northern Ireland if they're feeding their animals in their hens and in a different way. And every day something new comes up, which is why, you know, I think David Frost is quite right when he says it is just unsustainable. It can't go on apart from the societal difficulties that are there. It really is something that is going to have to end one way or the other.
But shouldn't Lord Frost have thought of that when he was negotiating the protocol?
Well, I understand it was really Michael Gove was actually much more involved in the detail of Northern Ireland. And I think from my meetings and contacts with Lord Frost, I genuinely think he gets it, you know. And the other, of course, important issue is the fact that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement has been breached as well, because the east-west, it was a very delicate balance between north-south and east-west. North-south is carrying on wonderfully, and east-west has been disrupted. So you can understand why pro-union people in Northern Ireland feel, you know, very angry, very let down, very abandoned by their own government. And, you know, that's not good for the union. People who want the union broken up, perhaps even Scottish nationalists, probably are quite happy with some of the things that are happening, but it's not good for the union, and I think the Conservatives, many of them now, are realising that.
One last question. I mean, recently you were quoted as saying you thought that the Irish Republic might come out of the European Union, but that's not going to happen, is it? But I'm more interested in, what do you think the future in terms of the political balance in Northern Ireland is going to be? What is, looking from your position as a convinced unionist, but in certain senses an observer of Northern Irish politics, where do you think the balance in Northern Ireland is going to move to?
Yeah, well, just very quickly on the Irish thing, I mean, 15 years ago people said the United Kingdom could never leave the European Union. So we'll see about that in 15 years' time. But, well, I think the important thing is that, yes, political parties in Northern Ireland are not particularly, you know, liked at the moment, and there's all of the parties are having major problems, even Sinn Féin. But ultimately, when it comes to the union, you know, an awful lot of people who don't vote DUP or don't even vote Unionist, and who, when it came to an actual vote about staying in the Union, staying in the United Kingdom, or giving up your British citizenship and becoming part of a United Ireland, would not vote for it. There's a silent vote for the Union, a bit like there was a silent vote for Brexit. Since I've been back in Northern Ireland now, I realise just how little the average member of, for example, the DUP gets involved. I mean, the idea that 38 people voted for their leader, I think that tells you something. So I think the parties in Northern Ireland do have to look at how they're working.
Baroness Hoey, thank you so much for joining us again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Coming up after the break, Alex continues his review of the future of Northern Ireland with Mick Fealty of the political blog Slugger O'Toole. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is examining the future of Northern Ireland. Over the last 20 years, a political blog, Slugger O'Toole, has emerged as the dominant place for discourse in Northern Ireland. Alex speaks to its founder and editor-in-chief, Mick Fealty.
Mick Fealty, Northern Ireland has just marked 100 years of existence. Is it going to see another 100th birthday?
It might well do. I mean, when partition was first brought in, many people, particularly nationalists who lived near the border, looked at the border post and saw they were going up in wood and assumed, like the British government, like perhaps the incipient Irish government, that partition was going to be a very temporary thing. But actually, it lasted another 50 years before Northern Ireland's state imploded in 1969. And then another 50 years after that, most of which has been characterised by a move towards away from violence and towards power sharing. So it may last another 100 years, but another 100 years, I think it's going to look very different to the one that we see today.
But what is this inner crisis in unionism? People on the outside seem to have very little idea. I mean, the Democratic Unionists, some 20 years ago under Ian Paisley, took over from the official Unionists. They seemed to be harder line, more working class, but they came to a power-sharing agreement with Sinn Féin. But now the Democratic Unionists are fracturing, spectacularly so over the last few weeks. What is this inner crisis in Northern Irish unionism?
Okay, well, let me try and explain it by use of demographics, if you like, because the terms unionism and nationalism don't really mean an awful lot of people outside Northern Ireland. And I include people in the Republic as well. Northern Ireland politics is a bit of a closed book, except for those fools of us who've spent large chunks of our lives trying to understand it and trying to explain it. But demographically, if you like, unionism historically, especially if you go back to 1922 when the partition of the island began, really unionism is a marker of Protestant for non-Catholic, if you like. And so what's happened really since then, when Northern Ireland was set up, it was set up deliberately with a strong, stable Protestant majority. But as time has gone on, first in those first 50 years until the Troubles began, it was a firm majority. And then over the last 50 years, we've seen decline and decline and decline. And with that, the certainty that holding that majority meant that Northern Ireland would stay in perpetuity within the United Kingdom, to greater and greater insecurity, but also lesser and lesser numbers to share between these two big unionist parties. And in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, we've seen other parties breaking through the middle as more and more Catholics and Protestants have declined to describe themselves as either one of those two religious blocs. And so I think what you're seeing here is an instability, because the reasoning for unionism coming together in the first place is only upheld by now a minority of people in Northern Ireland.
Therefore, but if you cannot have, to coin a phrase, a Protestant statelet for a Protestant people, because there are now less Protestants than Catholics on this year's census, we suspect, then how can Northern Ireland have a unionist future? How is it possible to have a unionist future if the basis of unionism is no more? Okay, so let's redefine where we've got to demographically, because although it's true to say there's no longer a Protestant majority, there is also not a Catholic majority in sight. In fact, despite the fact that Catholics at school age in Northern Ireland have a substantial majority over those in state schools, the proportion of Catholics in the population only went up by 1% in 2011. My suspicion is that the fastest growing bloc is those in the middle who will not describe themselves as Catholic or Protestant. If you like, these are people who at the ballot box are making post-constitutionalist choices about who they vote for. And I suspect when this year's census results are reported, the religious affiliation, we'll find that that bloc is something like 20% of the whole population, which means they're neither nationalist nor unionist. And that makes the fate of Northern Ireland more democratic, because it'll be about personal choice, not about personal tribal identity, and potentially more unstable. But it also means that unionists and nationalists will have to work for those in the middle who say a plague on both your houses. So let's talk about that 20% in the middle, people of no strong religious affiliation, not by upbringing, either nationalist or unionist. What's going to appeal to them the most? Is it going to be Brexit Britain, the venturing forth with Buccaneer Boris at the helm, or is it going to be the Irish Republic safely ensconced in the European Union? What is the future most attractive to, you reckon, to that 20%?
I think right now it's hard to tell in the long term, because Brexit is going to have to, we need to sort things out around protocol. The protocol, as you know, as a Scot, grants Northern Ireland certain privileges and rights that are not granted to the rest of the United Kingdom. So, for instance, firms that are set up in Belfast can export into the rest of the United Kingdom, but they can also have unfettered access into the rest of the European Union. So already, potentially, as long as people don't lose their wits on this, Northern Ireland is sitting with a huge strategic advantage just by being Northern Ireland. And that creates, what's strange about this is that unionists are the ones who've kicked up most about the very thing that might, in the long term, ensure that the union with the rest of the United Kingdom endures, because it gives Northern Ireland a strategic advantage it wouldn't have if it's simply unified with the rest of the country. Now, of this 20%, my supposition, and it's only a supposition, I can't point to clear data on this, most of them would have voted against Brexit. They're not particularly nationalist, they're not British nationalists or even Irish nationalists in it. What they're looking for are politicians who can work for them on bread and butter issues. And the political parties in Northern Ireland that seem to be prospering, or at least responding to that challenge best, are Naomi Long's Alliance Party, who've been around since 1970, and the moderate nationalist SDLP Party, who've, over the last 2 to 3 years, have been putting together what looks like a left-of-centre social democrat redistribution appeal. And I think it's only with those material appeals to those people in the middle for a better future that you're in any way have any chance of actually capturing that future, either for the continuance of the union with Britain or some radical realignment with the rest of the island.
Now, Mick Fealty, that's a pretty dramatic forecast. I mean, what you're saying is after a generation where Northern Irish politics moved to the extremes, who came to an accommodation with each other, that is, on one side Sinn Féin, on the other side the Democratic Unionists, you seem to be pointing to an era of the power of the middle, that the middle ground is going to prosper. Is that what you're saying?
The reason I think the middle is going to may well come through, is that at a certain point, their constituencies can join, so that you've got, if you like, kind of political molecules swapping and moving around between those two parties in a way that they simply can't between the DUP and Sinn Féin. I'm not trying to predict the future here, Alex, and I'm not trying to back out of what I've just said. I just think the potential for the middle ground to retake things lies in the fact that 20, and possibly, if you look at some of the survey data, 30% of the Northern Ireland population have had enough of a constitutional question that never delivers on the ground.
So, most people would argue that one of the things that's happened is with the departure from the scene of the two recent giants of Northern Irish politics, the Reverend Ian Paisley on the one hand and Martin McGuinness on the other, two people with the stature to basically dragoon the respective parties into line on power sharing. That has been the reason for the difficulties. You seem to be arguing there's something much more fundamental going on, that the ground is shifting from under the feet of the new leaders of Sinn Féin and the DUP, regardless of their stature.
In the last election, if you look at the performance of both the DUP and Sinn Féin, what you see is a drop. Now, slightly higher, I think, for the DUP than Sinn Féin, although to some extent that's partly because the SDLP stood back in one seat and allowed Sinn Féin to take a seat off the DUP, but that's detail. But in Foyle, which Sinn Féin have been working to take off the SDLP for years and managed to do it in 2017, they lost that seat by 17,000 votes to the SDLP. In South Belfast, which for years was difficult for the SDLP to hold on to, Claire Hanna came through with a massive majority because she started taking votes from even working class Protestant areas because they're fed up with this sham fight, a fight every day in Stormont that doesn't bring anything forward. So, I think there is definitely momentum there. You see it in the census figures. You see it in this pulling away from an argument over the Constitution that never seems to have any egress, except there's always the promise of a border poll sometime soon, but nobody ever puts any meat on those particular bones.
So finally, Mick Fealty, will Slugger O'Toole, will that be a safe space for the variety of points of view in Northern Irish politics for some time to come?
Well, I hope so. None of us are getting any younger, Alex. But, I think it's a good, safe space for people to at least share ideas that, and perspectives that otherwise wouldn't get shared. But, we'll see.
With that enigmatic note, Mick Fealty, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Pleasure, Alex.
Northern Ireland may be 100 years old, but the state of the province is very far from stable. After the Good Friday Agreement, with peace increasingly embedded, it was hoped that both communities would settle for a joint stake in the future. The European Union had effectively eliminated border politics in the island of Ireland, while all parties had a guaranteed stake in devolved government. Brexit destabilised everything. The threat of border post violence on land has been replaced by seething unionist discontent at the protocol agreed between Westminster and Europe over the heads of Stormont. As ever, in such a circumstance, politicians who suggest accommodation with reality are swept aside by those who prefer a hardline approach. Thus, the Democratic Unionist Party, the dominant party of Northern Ireland for the last 2 decades, has gone through 3 leaders in 3 weeks. It also doesn't help the Unionist insecurities to have the knowledge that this year's census is likely to record the first Protestant minority in the history of the province. Some, like Kate Hoey, believe that the political position will be resolved by Ireland leaving the European Union. Others believe that Irish unity is closer now than it has been since partition. Others yet, like Mick Fealty, see the emergence of a new centre bloc concentrating on the delivery of social and economic advances to an electorate tired of constitutional politics. Whatever the destination of change, the process of getting there is unlikely to be a comfortable one. And now from Alex, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.